Hello and welcome to Star Trek Sundays. Today's episode is Transcendence, in which we'll discuss how we see the theme presented and contemplated through Star Trek in Remember Me and Journey's End, both from Star Trek The Next Generation. If you're new here, I'm Victoria, and with me is my co-host T. Star Trek Sundays is a podcast through which we and our guest crew examine the philosophical themes presented in Star Trek every Sunday at 10 a.m. PST on Clubhouse. Our goal is not to come to conclusions on the themes we discuss, but to spark contemplation and conversation, which we hope continues after the live recording and into the lives of the listeners of the podcast. At the top of the room, we've pinned our Star Trek Sundays website, StarTrekSundays.com. There you'll find links to our published podcasts, links to our upcoming watch lists, and our Star Trek Sundays trading post. The Star Trek Sundays podcast is available 1 week after the live show on Pandora, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and from anywhere else you get your podcasts. Please consider subscribing to our channels. It helps us reach others who might enjoy the show. T, this is going to be super interesting to discuss with everybody, so I want to dig right in. I've got comments to say about the episodes a bit later. So can you tell us about what drew you to the topic of transcendence and how Star Trek examined this theme throughout the years?
Definitely, and thank you, Victoria. What drew me to the topic is we seem to be at an inflection point in time where we are developing the capability to rapidly progress what has for our entire history been limitations for us and move into a new era of enlightenment. As we master technology, it provides us with new insights that shows us the path forward, which we could never really see before. The idea of overcoming a hard limitation or transcending the limitation is something philosophers have been striving for as the Holy Grail, the key to unlocking our deepest potential. Be it the limitation of our knowledge, our capacity to reason, the very genes that make us up, or simply our own feelings, transcendence is a tantalizing goal, nebulous enough to be hard to define, while still being ultimately compelling as a destination. Star Trek often flirted with overcoming seemingly hard barriers as a plot mechanic, a device which challenged people to rethink their entire worldview. The Traveler is one such example with his mastery of warp technology. An enigmatic fellow, quiet and kind, but with the ability to transcend space and time, he helps the crew of the Enterprise, and specifically Wesley, on a few occasions, ultimately helping Wesley to find his path to transcend the stars. So, as a case study, I thought it'd be fun to do a deep dive into the Traveler and talk a little bit about what makes him tick and how we can learn about our own transcendence.
Thanks, T. Yeah, that's great. And that's really what I want to talk about is our own growth and how we transcend. And perhaps we can even learn from each other and from the shows, right? So let's get started with Remember Me. Can you provide us with a summary of Remember Me for those who didn't get a chance to view it this week? And then I'll pose a question to you.
Yes, Remember Me, The Next Generation, Season 4, Episode 5, first aired on the 22nd of October in 1990. I remember it really well because it was an episode that I thought, even as a young child watching it for the first time, touched me very deeply. In this episode, Dr. Beverly Crusher is caught in a static warp bubble that keeps causing the ship's crew to disappear. Meanwhile, Wesley realizes that his mother is stuck in the bubble, and the reason why the crew list is shrinking is the bubble is collapsing on her. Wesley makes a distress call to the Traveler, who appears to help Wesley discover a way forward. I chose this episode because it's a perfect demonstration of how the Traveler helps Wesley transcend his physical limitations and realize his true potential.
Thanks, T. Yeah, I really enjoyed this episode. And while I know it's Wesley and the Traveler that we were looking at, I felt a lot of empathy for Beverly as she was realizing that the crew list was shrinking and no one else seemed to realize it or worry about it. Like I felt a panic for her, and at one point she wondered if she was going insane. And I was feeling that. I was like, I would be wondering if I wasn't well as well. and, what I would do if I was in her shoes. And with that, I really saw Beverly transcend her own limitations in this episode. Like when she was expecting that the portal back to her normal physical ship, when she saw that portal come out, she thought it was something to avoid and kept herself from being pulled into it. And yet the whole time it was her pathway back. And she had to figure that out and her path along this way while we were also watching Wesley and the Traveler was really interesting. I thought this was a great episode and great to feature her as well. We see the Traveler arrive to guide Wesley in overcoming his limitations about the physical world. The Traveler's repeated advice is to let go. We hear that all the time, right? Everybody says, let go, let go. Let go of the expectations and the emotions that Wesley knows is holding him back. Maybe Wesley doesn't even know that at the time, but that the Traveler knows is holding Wesley back. So my question to you and to everybody else who's listening, you're going to have to answer this too, you guys. Have you ever been in a situation in which you realized you were holding yourself back and you needed to transcend your own limitations or the limitations put on you to achieve your goals?
Yes, I remember a long time seeing what other people were doing with computers, and especially with regards to money, and feeling like I was on the outside, like I was sort of like looking in through a dirty window at a game that was being played without me, and I was being, purposefully excluded. And then one day I got really angry at feeling left out. And I got so angry, I decided I just wasn't going to allow myself to be left out anymore. I was going to kick down the door, break the window, do whatever it took. And I started making changes in my life. I did things like go from 3 meals a day to 2 meals a day because, I'm not like starving or anything. I've got meat on my bones and I can do stuff like that. But what that allowed me to do is that allowed me to skip lunch, and I would take the 8 or 10 or $12 or whatever it was that I was spending on, a meal at McDonald's or whatever it happened to be, and I put that towards my portfolio. And what that did is that allowed me to start building up my portfolio and start participating in the money game. And the more changes I made in myself, the more I realized I was the person who was holding me back. It took a really long time, 3 years plus, to really change habits with regards to money. But looking back, I can now see all the ways in which my old habits were the problem, and I needed to transcend my thinking in order to progress in my goals.
Wow. Right. Yeah. Transcending our thinking. Okay, that's going to be interesting. Let's see if we can bring a few people up here and see if they can tell us about their own journeys and if this relates to them at all. So, Ryan, thanks for coming. I was really looking forward to hearing what you had to say about this today. So, Ryan, have you ever been in a situation where you realized you were holding yourself back and you needed to transcend your own limitations or the limitations that others put on you in order to achieve your goals?
Hey, good morning. Yeah, very much so. So I grew up with ADD, diagnosed at a young age, but still in the 1980s and 1990s, the solution back then was to just drug kids. And there were certain things that I never fully understood that I was doing that I caught on to later on in life. One of those things being tone modulation, where I was told repeatedly that my tone was extremely aggressive or unkind. But from my perspective, I was just, speaking a truth. And it wasn't until I found a good psychiatrist and a good medication that I realized my behavior. Because before I was just stopped, right? Like someone would react a certain way and I would be perplexed, I would be confused. And once I got on the right medication, I started seeing how my behavior previously had been problematic. And once that blind spot was illuminated on, I could do something about it. But, the reality is that there's lots of people who are neurodivergent who are unable to look at themselves from inside the box, and it's not until they're on the right medication or on the right therapy or the right set of circumstances where they can see themselves from the outside in. And that was definitely something that changed my life, right? Where I went from someone who felt that they had to be right, and that being right was worth more than being liked, to someone who could find a middle ground between being liked and understood and and being right.
Wow, that speaks to me because I had a counselor once who would constantly put to me, "Well, Victoria, you sometimes have to decide, do you wanna be right or do you wanna be happy? You can't always be both." And I, of course, at that point, I was in counseling because I was like, "I wanna be happy about being right." So that's great. But I also hear in that there were other people, and of course, you were a child when this was happening, but that transcendence helps or is helped by others, that others can assist in our transcendence. And that's something that maybe we can talk about a bit later, considering letting people help us, because I know as adults, sometimes it's hard to let people help us, but also learning how we help others. And I think that speaks to the way in which the traveler helps Wesley. And it's not by telling him what to do so much as showing him and being an example. So I really appreciate that. T, did you have anything to say about Ryan's share before we go on to Pratik?
No, other than, I always love Ryan shares. He always just leaves me, thinking, and I love that. So thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. Pratik, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. You can let me know. Welcome to Star Trek Sundays and welcome to the stage. I'd like to put the question to you. Have you ever been in a situation where you realized you were holding yourself back and you needed to transcend your own limitations or those limitations that are put on to you by others in order to achieve your goals?
Yeah, first of all, Victoria, you got my name perfectly right. And yes, it's nice to be here. Coming back to the question, it is about like how we were able to surpass our limitations or limitations enforced upon us and achieve our goals. So for me, it was not something very substantial, but more about the kind of I would say constraints that I was living as I was living with as I was growing up, which was sort of enforced maybe by my parents or through society in terms of being able to take my own decisions and backing myself behind my own decisions. So I grew up in India, and generally, even though we are adults, and even though like generally parents tend to have a lot of influence in your decision making of your day to day life. It was until my late 20s and almost about early 30s that I started to take my own decision and back myself and not get influenced or stop being gullible, and that helped me, I would say, do a lot of damage control and course correction in various aspects of my life. So it is not something very substantial, but yes, that is what I have to share right now.
Oh, thank you. So, what change happened as you came into adulthood that made you be able to transcend those other expectations? Was it just maturing?
I think I was able to, I became a better decision maker, and I was able to back my own decisions in terms of um, like whether it is investments, whether it is career choices, whether it is maybe relationships as well. So in various walks of life, I felt that I was I was influenced by people around me, and I was even though I had some maybe sort of unpopular choices, like I took a career break in between when I was just about 25. Like I had quit my career to start something of my own, and I was kind of like I was influenced to get a job again. So those kind of decisions, like I thought that uh, a lot of my decisions were not mine but were influenced by people around me, and gradually since around that time I was able to start like back myself that whatever decisions I'm taking, I have the complete ownership. It is my decision to make, it is my responsibility, and that just helped me maybe have more ownership of my life.
I like that phrase, ownership of your life. It struck me.
I'm
Go ahead,
sorry.
T.
I was just going to say, I really love what you said about becoming a better decision maker and recognizing the influence that people have in your life, and then transcending those influences and realizing that there's a journey there, and sometimes that journey feels like it's laid out by other people, but when you choose to deviate from that, when you choose to start thinking for yourself and you choose to become a better decision maker, you can see that maybe that's not the path that you ought to go down, and you change the direction of your life and you end up in a better place. And I just think that that's really, really a great story, and I really love the way that you put that, Pratik. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I think back to you, Victoria.
Yeah, thanks, Pratik. Yeah, I do really like the way you phrase some things, like the ownership and becoming a better decision maker, and it's great having your contribution here. So thank you. Jamesy, welcome to the stage. I'll put the question to you. I know that you know Star Trek really well and might have something to say about the episodes, but have you ever been in a situation where you realized you were holding yourself back and you needed to transcend your own limitations or the limitations others put on you in order to achieve your goals?
Kind of. I think for me the question reads a little bit differently than it does for most people. Obviously it's kind of a parent's job to mold their offspring, and I found that the mold that I was trying to be cast in kind of uh, wasn't going to work for me. So this this journey of just how anti-conformist do I want to be, or maybe I could find more fulfillment by intentionally investing myself in a set of projects like that kind of thing has been it's taken some turns that have surprised me. But life definitely hasn't turned out the way that I thought it was when I was a child, and it's a weird thing to think had my life turned out differently, I would have kind of followed this path. And I kind of don't like that person. I kind of like who I am. And I think on some level, that's kind of the point. Whether or not that person would have liked me is kind of a little bit of a defeater for that line of thinking. But something that stuck in my head here in this little dialogue was being right or being happy. I think I would rather be right. I think when it comes to emotional self-regulation, it's more important for my emotional state to comport with reality. Like I want the things that I'm feeling to be the things that I ought be feeling, rather than making the goal just kind of always existing above baseline. Because if you always exist above baseline, then that's your baseline. That's not what a baseline is.
I feel like that could be a philosophical topic for a whole show, right? In and of itself. Is it better to be right or to be happy? And I think that your answer was especially insightful. I'm going to have to think more about that.
Yeah, same, same. It strikes me, and the reason I was in counseling is because I was putting being right and this whole reality thing ahead of everything else, and it was causing me to be unhappy. But I think part of that was because the way in which I was communicating my rightness might not have been received as well as it could be as I became a better communicator, a better decision maker. So I think there can be a balance there. But I have learned over time to this is this is a totally different topic as well. But I've learned over time to let go of the stories that I tell myself, especially if I don't know all the information, because I find that some of those stories lead me to not feeling happy. And at the same time, I can't be sure I'm right because I don't have all the information. So that is interesting. I'm going to put a pin in that for sure. And we have a couple of episodes already sorted for the next couple of weeks, but definitely I'll put a pin in that. Is it better? And then we've got to discuss what is better. That in itself will have to be discussed. But thanks for that, Jamesy. I really appreciate it.
Can I round this off just a little bit?
Absolutely.
So kind of the idea here is that if your happiness is dependent on getting other people or the world to behave and be a certain way, you are setting yourself up for just never being happy. Like that can't be the prerequisite for your happiness. But if you can make peace with the world as it is, invest yourself intentionally into making the world the way you want it to be, and then allowing your own emotional regulation to be transcendent from the actual reality, then you can find yourself in a very fulfilling, transcendent place.
Yeah, that is great. Wow, you're speaking to me right now because I have some situations going on that I'm going to save for next week because it's Mother's Day next week and I want to share a little bit about my relationship with my mom and this whole right or happy and how we can find that balance is really important. I think in some of these familial relationships. So I'm gonna put a pin in that for Mother's Day, and then maybe that can lead into this right or happy in a couple of weeks. So thank you for that. This is Star Trek Sundays on Clubhouse. Our regular show is Sunday at 10 a.m. PST. To be notified of future shows, please join the house on Clubhouse and our mailing list at StarTrekSundays.com. Today we're discussing Transcendence. Before we move on to Journey's End, T, can you tell us what we have coming up for next week's podcast and watch party?
You bet. We have Haven from the Next Generation. In this episode, we first meet Counselor Troy's mother, Loxana Troy, the star of this week's theme. Loxana has come to the Enterprise to finalize the arranged marriage of Counselor Troy to Wyatt Miller, a doctor who has come to the Enterprise with his parents for the wedding. While the companion story of the Trellians and the virus they carry is important to the wedding story, this episode, for better or for worse, sets up Star Trek fans for years of fun with Loxana, followed by Dark Page from the Next Generation. As a bookend to our journey with Loxana, this is the last episode in the Next Generation in which she appears, and one in which we see the close bond between her and her daughter, Counselor Deanna Troy. Loxana returns to the Enterprise as a teacher of the Karen, a species that communicates through telepathy only, and is learning from Loxana how to speak so they can communicate with other species. But then Loxana falls ill, and it's revealed she has a secret which Counselor Troy helps her to reveal. It's a beautiful episode, and I'm really looking forward to this one, and a great Mother's Day.
Thanks, T. Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching those shows as well. Oksana is interesting for me because I really love the shows in which she appears, but I also have empathy for Captain Picard and Deanna a great deal. She kind of rubs me the wrong way, and yet I love being around her. Just glad I'm not on the Enterprise when she's there. But I just wanted to add something about Mother's Day. Mother's Day can be wonderful for many, and lots of people celebrate it by taking mom out for breakfast and brunch and stuff. But it's also very painful for others, those who are mothers who've lost children, those who want to be mothers but are unable for whatever reason, and mums and kids who have difficult relationships with each other. And I hope we can examine all of it so everyone knows that they are not alone on that day. Star Trek Sundays is a space in which we examine our thoughts and our feelings without judgment. So, no matter your situation with your mother or your kids, please feel free to join us next week. Let's move on to Journey's End. T, can you provide a summary of the episode to remind those who didn't get a chance to review it what it was about? And then I'll put the question to you.
You bet. Journey's End from the Next Generation, Season 7, Episode 20, first aired on the 28th of March, 1994. This is like 3 or 4 episodes before the end of the entire The Next Generation. It was sort of a bookend for a lot of the plot lines that involved Wesley Crusher. In this episode, Wesley Crusher returns to the Enterprise after a few years at Starfleet Academy. Much to everyone's surprise, he behaves disrespectfully and arrogantly, which we later learn is due to his feeling lost and not knowing if a career in Starfleet is right for him. I chose this episode because it ends with Wesley transcending everything that has been holding him back, starting with the people around him, Starfleet, morality, space and time, as he becomes a traveler himself.
Thanks, T. Once again, in this episode, we see that the companion stories seem to align with each other, or at least it seems like the companion stories also talk to transcendence. And perhaps that's because we go into Star Trek Sundays with this intentional watch. So here we saw the Puebloan settlers of Dorvan 5 refuse to leave after the Federation signs a treaty with the Cardassians to hand over the planet. And the Puebloans do the unexpected and request to live with the Cardassians and leave the Federation in order to stay on Dorvan 5. So I saw this as them transcending the limitations put on them by the Federation. And so I really like the way these stories kind of run parallel to each other. And so I'd be interested to talk about that with you all later after we answer the personal question. So we also see Wesley achieve a goal that he could only ever dream of achieving when he leaves Starfleet and joins the Traveler and transcends space and time. To me, transcendence is more about the climb and overcoming something rather than an end goal, because we always want to keep going and not think there's a hard stop to our growth type of thing. So let me ask you this. Do you have some ultimate ambition which seems out of reach at the moment due to limitations imposed by yourself or others, but that you would like to achieve anyway by transcending those limitations?
Yes, big time. I've always wanted to write a general AI capable of learning and growing in its capacity. And in some ways, that still seems like a lot of work, but I dream about a day in which all humans are freed from the erroneous task of trying and failing. It just sucks. And I want computers to help them succeed in their every goal. And as a species, we in turn transcend our petty differences and embrace a new era of accomplishment. Now, I realize it's a lofty goal and it's far off, and it's a bit of a pipe dream in many ways.
Mm. Yeah, that is a lofty goal. Hey, Ryan, so how about you? Do you have some ultimate ambition which seems out of reach at the moment due to limitations imposed on you by yourself or others, but that you'd like to achieve anyway by transcending those limitations?
That's an interesting question because I've been thinking about it. And the reality is that the things that I thought were out of reach I've already achieved, right? Like I wanted to be the cinematographer of a feature film and I did it. And then I said, well, I want to shoot another feature film and I did it. And so then in terms of personal fulfillments, the goals that I set out for myself when I was a lot younger, I've achieved, and it hasn't given me that sense of completion. Now, what has given me that sense of completion were the unexpected things, like having my daughter. That gave me a much deeper sense of completion than these exterior goals that I set out for myself many years ago. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't other things I want to do, right? Like, I'd like to make a few stop motion animation shorts that deep delve into my psychology and into my personality, but that itself seems significantly easier than curating a life. And so there's nothing that I haven't done already that I wanted to do. Like I've already done it. And the things that I want to do seem within reach, they just require time. And so as long as I have time, those goals are achievable. And in some ways, I'm somewhat not antithetical to T, but I'm someone who was very excited by technology. And then when the technology got here, I sort of went in the opposite direction, right? So, like, instead of focusing on CG animation, I've focused on stop motion animation, objects that are human objects, objects that are physical, and photographing light that's non-synthetic. And even though I do use things like ChatGPT for certain things, waking that system up is not my goal because I already have something like that, right? I produced a person. That person woke up and is alive and is thriving and is growing exponentially the way that a happy child should. So in some ways the only things that I have left to achieve are things on my list, but they're not out of reach. They're not impossibilities. They're just things I need time for.
And without argument, Ryan, you are a better, more efficient programmer who achieved the goal that I'm still working to achieve with my code, right? Your offspring do everything that I want my code to do and does it better than my code can do it. So, I recognize that you are correct, that there isn't a need here, that we already do these things, that what I'm talking about is maybe perhaps a vanity, if you will.
Well, and your needs are not my needs, right? Like you and I are part of the human experiment, and we fulfill different roles. And I see absolutely nothing wrong with what you're doing, right? Like I'm excited that you're doing it. It's necessary and inevitable because from the beginning we started dreaming about these things, right? Like the first religions that we came up with, we also came up with the golem, right? And the first watches that we made human synthesoids with them, mechanisms that appear human but are just gears. And you fast forward into the future, and we're going to keep doing that. Instead of breathing life into clay with magic, and instead of having a repetitive automaton with gears, we're going to imbue silicone with life and agency. And so I don't see anything wrong with that. Humanity is creating its own offspring and children that will eventually replace us. That is, in fact, inevitable. But for me, as an artist who was very much excited by Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, by Robo Sapien, by a whole slew of books on robotics in 2005, 2006, I was on that track as well. And then something changed. I had a kid and I realized, oh, I already did it. And so then my reaction to the uncanny valley was not to lean into it, but to go back to fabric and plastic and wood. And I use technology with those tools. I got myself a laser cutter. And all of a sudden, my scope of what I can do has opened up significantly, but I'm still using physical materials, right? And so, no, I love that you're doing what you're doing. Of course, it has to be done because there's no other way. There's a cosmic evolution at work, and that next life form is what comes next.
Yeah, that's great. It's really interesting because what you two are talking about, there's some differences obviously, but through this whole prep for this episode, this show, and through the conversation, I get more and more away from goals being the transcendence for me and the pathway being the transcendence. And by that I mean, like, if I were to answer this question, I would have a very difficult time because the ambition that I've come to over the last couple of years, and the pandemic really sort of helped me focus on this, is more about transcending the limitations in my mind about me and who I am, the need to know who I am, and all of that, more so than goals of certain, a bank account or a certain place to travel or like actual doing things with my body. It has more to do with what's going on in my mind. And of course, you guys add to this so much. So I really appreciate it. Welcome to the stage, Corletta. I'm going to move to Pratik and put this to you, Pratik. Do you have some ultimate ambition which seems out of reach at the moment due to limitations imposed on you by yourself or others, but that you would like to achieve anyway by transcending those limitations?
Sure. Thanks, Victoria, for the question. So this question has it's a thought-provoking question for me because probably until before I had this, like I took part in this discussion, I did not have a specific goal. But then I try to ask myself, if I were to have an ultimate goal, what would it be? And of late, I am developing a growing interest in problems of global scale and what needs to be done to solve them. So if I would need to articulate a problem of like a ultimate goal, then it would be to contribute to solving problems of global scale, understanding them, and maybe the immediate short-term goal would be to maybe write my own series of articles or blog, or maybe a book, or just a list of steps that how I would approach to solve this problem if I had the resources. I'm a firm believer that majority of the problems that we are facing today, we can say that none of the problems, almost at some level or the other, the problems have been faced by somewhere on Earth or at some point in time in the history of Earth or history of the world before. But it's a very dynamic kind of landscape, and even though we might have a lot of history or data or knowledge of multiple disciplines, it is our own limitations of being able to collaborate with other people, other humans, that hold us back. I mean, I'm talking at a global scale. So being able to understand what needs to be done to overcome these barriers or limitations and collaborate better with uh, people from, like, with anybody else, to be able to solve them and make a positive difference. I think I would like to contribute to this. And currently the only thing that is holding me back is maybe, yeah, I mean, having enough time, or being able to devote enough time or resources apart from my job, I mean, which I do to earn a living. But I'm quite hopeful that like with if I do have good health, and then maybe in the next 10 years or so, I would be in a better state to make a, like, make a positive contribution. Yeah, back to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Pratik. That's great. We hear that a lot, the need to work, right? Like you said, you would concentrate on this, but you need to earn a living. And I think some of this technology that T's working on, and some of the progression in governments and stuff that might be able to help people have to work less time at a job that pays them in order to live, maybe with some sort of basic income or something like that, so that people didn't have to work 40 or 60 hours a week and then just recover in order to work 40 or 60 hours another week, so that people could work maybe 20 or 30 hours a week to earn a living and then be able to spend time trying to achieve some of these goals, or at least transcending some of the problems. So I really appreciate your view on that. Thank you. Jamesy, how about you? Do you have some ultimate ambition which seems out of reach at the moment due to limitations imposed on you by yourself or others, but that you would like to achieve anyway by transcending those limitations?
I think I've kind of identified where this question speaks to me the most. I've kind of regarded being frugal, or at least thrifty, to be like almost an immutable characteristic for me. It's just part of who I am. And I think part of that is my upbringing, but part of it is just hardship or whatever. My doctor recently prescribed more exercise. I know it's very very depressing. And I found myself like what would I like actually like to do? And I'm getting ready to make a pretty big purchase that is something that brings a lot of satisfaction to my life. And I'm looking forward to that kind of becoming something that defines me more than my thriftiness. But like in the kind of zoomed out perspective, I think the biggest thing is just like I want to be able to look back on my life and feel like it was a life worth living, that I contributed more than I took, that my carbon imprint on the world was had some justification.
Wow, deep. Yeah. Yeah, I think that kind of reflection can happen throughout our life, right? Like when you said that just now, I was like, "Oh God, have I contributed more than I've taken?" Oh, that's something to think about. That's wild. And I do appreciate frugalness and thriftiness. Did you want to share with us what your purchase is going to be?
Sure. You know, I'm an avid water sport guy. I go out free
Hmm.
diving whenever the water is good enough, and I try to go paddle boarding every Saturday. Yeah, I'm going to invest in a real nice windsurfing board that I can set up with a sculling rig and always have an excuse to go on the water. There would have to be a storm for me to not have an excuse to go to the water, and I think I'm going to be able to do that pretty much every day.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, that's great. Yeah, congratulations. Yeah, hope to hear more about your adventures on the water. Corletta, thanks for coming up. Really interested to hear what you have to say in response to the question. So, do you have some ultimate ambition which seems out of reach at the moment due to limitations imposed on you by yourself or others, but that you would like to achieve anyway by transcending those limitations?
To be honest, I don't ever even have that thought of anything of transcendence. I find that a very intriguing question because something that would be considered beyond the normal and physical level, I don't think I have ever thought past what I can physically do as a human being. Sometimes I'm a little upset with myself when I do not do things that I am capable of doing because I'm either lazy or procrastinate or just lose interest in doing it. And then like later on, I'm like, then I end up doing it, and I'm like, you see, you could have fucking done that 2 years ago. Why didn't you do it then? It's like, well, be thankful you did it now, right? So, no, not really. I'm actually pretty damn happy. Yeah, I guess I could be happier, but I guess I'm willing to hopefully catch that proverbial wave that will maybe bring me to that next level. I guess I don't know. I'm just riding life, man. I'm loving it. So yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I can say that I'm not really surprised by your answer. I know you a little bit. So with the beyond your capabilities, but I also know, I mean, you were a competitive cyclist, right? Professionally. Weren't you a professional cyclist?
Yeah, I was an amateur at a high level, like category one. That's as high as you can go as an
Oh,
amateur.
okay.
So I raced with the pros. I wasn't quote unquote paid. However, everything related to cycling was provided for me. Like I didn't have to spend anything. Like if I had a race to get to, that was all taken care of. Even eating.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, so quote unquote, I guess you consider that somewhat semi-pro.
Yeah, but it's just interesting because that is transcending some limitations, physical limitations, right? Like you're I guess, it's still in the physical world. We're not talking about, Wesley Crusher in space and time, but it is actually achieving something that goes beyond the average human being's
Yeah, I
like
get that. Right.
capabilities, right?
Right.
So it's interesting. I know that you go with the flow a little bit, right? I just wonder how much you maybe subconsciously direct that flow. But it's a good way of living for sure.
Yeah, I guess I do direct it quite a bit because even though I go with the flow, I'm also the salmon that constantly swims upstream, right? So I do a lot of things that are against the rules and regulations of society a little bit. Not that I'm doing things that harm people. I just don't adhere to all the rules and regulations, right?
Right, and that's something Jamesy brought up in the last question. He said something about being a nonconformist, and I think that's transcending the expectations of society, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess I can agree with that for sure.
I love all the shares and I love the goals. I'm struggling to think of one for myself because what what I keep thinking, in the last week is I want to transcend anxiety. I want to transcend worry, because I think once I do that, and when I do on occasion live free of those feelings, and maybe transcending expectations of society a bit more than I do, at that point I feel like totally empowered to do all of the other like physical goals that might come. Do we have any more thoughts on anything on the topic today?
Well, I do want to add that these particular uh, episodes are near and dear to my heart. Wesley gets a lot of hate. I get it. he can be annoying at times, but I think that for some of us, at least, Wesley was was very much a representation of, whereas a child, I was watching this at the age of, I think I was probably 7 or even younger than that, right? And so to see him, not be allowed on the bridge, to see him be treated as a child, he was very much a stand-in. And then 7 years later, as I'm sort of like, rapidly barreling down on my teenage years, to see him uh, push into and beyond the stars, I think that was a very inspirational story, and it's something that stayed with me, despite the hate that Wesley would sort of later come to receive. So, with that in mind, I really appreciated the episodes, the lessons, the crew. I mean, you guys were amazing. Absolutely hit the nail on the head, as you always do. But really, a great discussion of just an interesting philosophical topic for me. And I think that this was absolutely incredibly enjoyable. My church, my atheist church, as it were, that's just all Star Trek, and I love it.
Yeah, thanks to Sundays. Well, I'll just go. It's a small stage, so let's just go through. Ryan, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the desire to transcend is always there, and we've been trying to do that with very different tools and devices throughout time. We came up with religion as a way to try and transcend our mentality at that time. Some of us grew up out of it, and we elected to go with something else, like Star Trek. The desire to transcend is always there. Um, how we get there is, I think, the big question, right? And is it even possible to truly transcend when we're fixed in the river of time? I'm Ryan, and I'm never complete.
That's right. Well, thank you for that, Ryan. Pratik, the newbie, thanks for coming. Did you have any final thoughts on the topic?
Oh, I think it was a fascinating discussion, and I got to learn a lot. I'm just glad that I ch- like I decided to be a part of this discussion, and I'm really glad. I'm looking forward to more discussions of this kind. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you for participating. We've enjoyed having you. Jamesy.
While we were talking about sea monsters, I was thinking of Geordi telling Scotty about the Star Child and souring the milk. And I found myself wondering, in a world with tricorders and scanners where everything is videotaped, that also has, Borg and Q and living space creatures, like just how fantastic would a story have to be for skepticism to say, like, no, that didn't happen? Like, in the Star Trek universe, how bizarre would a claim have to be for people to dismiss it?
Yeah, well, that's a topic. That's another pin that I will place in the board, because that would be a great topic to discuss. Yeah, thanks for that. This is Star Trek Sundays on Clubhouse. Our regular show is Sunday at 10 a.m. PST. To be notified of future shows, please join the house on Clubhouse and our mailing list at StarTrekSundays.com. Today, we were discussing Transcendence. Thank you to everyone who has participated in the show and to our listening supporters. Please join us next week for our Mother's Day special, and we hope you have a great week.
Thank you, everyone. Live long and prosper.